What's up and welcome back, everyone. So I was on Tumblr a few months ago, and on this particular post that I was reading, there was cover art from the Daenerys novella that was all of her chapters from A Dance with Dragons that George compiled and published in ASOIAF Science Fiction. And I remembered that that wasn't the only time that George had done that. So I went and looked it up because I wasn't sure exactly of like the dates and everything, but I went back and looked it up. And for A Game of Thrones, George did the same thing with all of Dany's chapters, and he put them together in a novella, published it in ASOIAF Science Fiction magazine, and it was called Blood of the Dragon. And that particular issue came out in July of 1996, but A Game of Thrones wasn't published until August 1st of 1996. So that means that Dany was the first introduction for many people to the world of ice and fire. I'm gonna get emotional talking about this. I just think that's really special, that Dany was some people's first introduction to this entire series. But anyway, without further ado, let's dive into this chapter because Daenerys I is a really meaty fucking chapter, and it takes hold from the very beginning and does not let you go throughout the entire chapter. It's one of the longest first POV chapters of all the characters in the story, and there's so much packed within Dany I. So let's dive right in. We first meet Dany when she's a guest in Illyrio's manse, and her brother Viserys is presenting her with this gorgeous, like, fine, delicate gown, and she's never had anything this fancy before. And we immediately get a sense for Dany's character based on how she reacts to this. The cloth was so smooth that it seemed to run through her fingers like water. She could not remember ever wearing anything so soft. It frightened her. She pulled her hand away. Is it really mine? So Dany is being presented with this gown. She's a 13-year-old girl. She's being presented with this gown by her brother, and her immediate first thought is that this is a scary thing, and she's questioning if she can actually keep it. So it gives the reader a sense of the kind of life that Dany has lived and just how much she thinks about everything. Why does he give us so much, she asked. What does he want from us? Dany was 13, old enough to know that such gifts seldom come without their price, here in the free city of Pentos. So Viserys is in this high mood, and he's all excited about this dinner later on where he's gonna, basically try to sell his sister off to this guy that neither of them know. And Dany is thinking about the cost to her. She's thinking about Illyrio's motivations for giving her this fancy gown. Like, he can't be giving this to me just to be a nice guy. He's got to be getting something out of this. And of course, we learn later on, Illyrio had got his cut from the Dothraki for brokering this marriage between Daenerys and Drogo. So none of that is revealed to the reader yet, but Dany is already thinking so many steps ahead, and immediately we see just how perceptive her character is. Catelyn was a really perceptive character, picking up on all of the signs and symbolism and stuff that she was interpreting in her chapter, but Dany reads people so well, and she reads situations. And this is obviously a skill that you learn she needed to develop in order to survive. So this is her description of Illyrio. It was also said that he'd never had a friend he wouldn't cheerfully sell for the right price. Dany listened to the talk in the streets, and she heard these things. But she knew better than to question her brother when he wove his webs of dream. So that Dany even has the forethought to listen to the talk in the streets about Illyrio says so much about all of the things that she's gone through. She knows better. Viserys is older than her, and he doesn't. He grew up in King's Landing. He grew up the son of the king, and he was very privileged. But Dany wasn't. Before they end up at Illyrio's manse, you learn that their lives had been mean and that they had had to sell off possessions in order to buy food. On the one hand, Dany is a very gentle character, but at the same time, it's kind of hardened her, and she has a lot of street smarts, which is one of the reasons why I don't understand how so many people, usually people who hate Dany's character, can say that they think Viserys would have made a better ruler than Dany, or that Viserys would have made a good king. It's like, no. He just trusts Illyrio blindly and is basically like writing him a blank check for when he becomes king of Westeros. Like, oh yeah, sure, I'll hook up my friends when I'm king. But he has no idea what that means. And the fact that Dany thinks that Illyrio has no friend that he wouldn't cheerfully sell for the right price, you know, Viserys isn't even thinking that he could be one of those friends that would be sold for the right price, but Dany is. And on top of Viserys just being completely fucking clueless, like, he's an awful person. When they're talking about the dinner later on, he says, Illyrio will send the slaves in to bathe you. Be sure you wash off the stink of the stables. Khal Drogo has 1,000 horses. Tonight he looks for a different sort of mount. He's referring to his baby sister as just a hole to be filled. And people think he could make a good king. They think that he's better than Dany. Ugh, oh my god. Yeah, this video is gonna get really salty really quick. People liking Viserys. Need I remind people that right after this, he grabs her nipple through her shirt and twists it and is basically like threatening her that if she doesn't, you know, do a good job in impressing Drogo and, you know, attaining this engagement, that he's basically going to, you know, beat her up or something. You will not fail me tonight. If you do, it will go hard for you. You don't want to wake the dragon, do you? His fingers twisted her, the pinch cruelly hard through the rough fabric of her tunic. Do you? He repeated. No, Dany said meekly. Her brother smiled. Good. He touched her hair, almost with affection. Almost with affection. Like, he's not even capable of that kind of affection. He's not even capable of affection, period. Viserys is obviously a really complex character. He's been through shit too. He was kicked out of his home, his parents are dead, his older brother who he loved is dead, you know, everybody he knew basically is just gone from his life and all he has is Dany. But at the same time, that doesn't give him any kind of right to take out his anger and frustration in life out on her. The fact that that's what he turns to in order to exercise his frustration just shows what kind of person he is, and he's a shitty person. But anyway, let's get back to Dany. So Viserys leaves her and she's waiting for Illyrio's slaves to come in and bathe her, and she looks out her window and she sees these children, and this line, for a moment she wished she could be out there with them, barefoot and breathless, dressed in tatters, with no past and no future, and no feast to attend to Khal Drogo's mans. Like, that line, I think, sums up Dany's character better than any other line in any of her chapters. Dany has no desire for any finery. She has no desire for any position of power. She doesn't want anything aside from just to be a kid and, you know, to live a simple life. And, you know, some people will argue, oh, well, this is just her first chapter and she changes once she gets a taste of power later on, blah, blah, blah. But no, she doesn't. Like, in A Dance with Dragons, she thinks about her relationship with Daario, and all she wants is her house with the red door and to live a simple life with him as man and wife. And she thinks that if Daario wanted that, she would gladly give up her crown for that. But she knows that he wouldn't want that because he's more attracted to her power than he is attracted to her as a person. He doesn't want a wife, he wants the queen. So it's this idea that's reinforced throughout Dany's story that all she really wants is home. She just wants this sense of home. It doesn't even have to be King's Landing or Westeros. She just wants something that feels like home, like her house with the red door when she was little. And then we get Dany's thoughts, you know, obviously heavily influenced by Viserys. We get her thoughts on Robert's rebellion. Viserys had been a boy of 8 when they fled King's Landing to escape the advancing armies of the usurper, but Daenerys had been only a quickening in their mother's womb. Yet sometimes Dany would picture the way it had been. So often had her brother told her the stories. The midnight flight to Dragonstone, moonlight shimmering on the ship's black sails, her brother Rhaegar battling the usurper in the bloody waters of the Trident and dying for the woman he loved. The sack of King's Landing by the ones Viserys called the usurper's dogs, the lords Lannister and Stark. Princess Elia of Dorne pleading for mercy as Rhaegar's heir was ripped from her breast and murdered before her eyes. The polished skulls of the last dragon staring down sightlessly from the walls of the throne room, while the Kingslayer opened father's throat with a golden sword. So we had Catelyn's perspective of the rebellion in her chapter, Mad King Aerys calling for Ned and Robert's heads, and they're just teenagers, and Jon Arryn raising his banners in revolt to protect them. And it sounds all, very like it was a justified war. And then you get Dany's perspective, or should I say Viserys's, because he's the one who told her all of this, and he had no idea that their father was actually mad. But from their perspective, this sounds fucking terrifying. And whereas the Starks were presented as the heroes in Catelyn's chapter, they were just responding to Mad King Aerys. This presents an entirely different viewpoint of the war. And the ones Viserys called the usurper's dogs, Lords Lannister and Stark, sacking a city, okay, honorable Ned Stark. We don't have the distinction here yet that it was just Tywin Lannister's troops. So you're thinking the whole time, okay, did Ned participate in this? Did he sack this city? What was he doing throughout this? And then, you get, this horrible image of Rhaegar's heir, this baby being ripped from Princess Elia and murdered before her eyes. This is some violent shit. And these were supposed to be the heroes of the rebellion? What the fuck? And of course, Dany doesn't learn the truth about her father until much later on. So this is her reference point for everything throughout the majority of her journey. She thinks of Lannister and Stark as just being these rabid dogs who sacked the city, who, tore a baby from its mother and murdered it before her eyes and then raped her. And, then this guy who was supposed to be their father's protector, the Kingslayer, opening their father's throat with a golden sword. How else is Dany supposed to think of King's Landing and Westeros and the things that are going on there when this, all of this is true? It's not, yes, Viserys has maybe kind of a twisted view of what happened, but this all still fucking happened. There were atrocities on both sides of this war. While, the Starks and Robert are presented as the heroes and they were fighting this mad king, at the same time, people on their side did really fucking horrible shit. And there is no excuse for that. And there is, no apology in the world that can be made to Dany for the things that happened to her family. You can argue either way whether or not this was a just war, but it doesn't matter if this was a just war or not, because innocent people on both sides got completely fucked over. And I think that's the point. We get further proof of just how shitty Viserys is. Her mother had died birthing her, and for that, her brother Viserys had never forgiven her. So he blames her for her mom's death when, she didn't have any choice as to her existence, but her brother blames her for their mom's death anyway. So who does that sound like? I mean, come on. Mom died birthing them, older sibling blames the younger sibling for the mom's death. It's totally Cersei and Tyrion. I don't remember when it's mentioned in either Tyrion's chapters or Cersei's that Cersei blames him for their mother's death, but it is mentioned later on. So that her and Tyrion have that connection at all, I think is really neat. And it goes back to that whole idea. Tyrion says later on in the story he has a soft spot in his heart for cripples, bastards, and broken things. And you know, he and Dany are two of those broken things who have this blame put on them from a family member, someone who's supposed to love them and protect them, and it's just so unfair. So I really like that those two have that connection. We get information about Sir Willem Darry, who had taken Viserys and Dany across the Narrow Sea, had rescued them, and had been, you know, like their protector up until his death. And Dany describes him as a great gray bear of a man. I don't know if that's significant, like Sir Willem being compared to a bear and him being Dany's protector when she was young, but then Sir Jorah Mormont coming along and being her protector throughout a lot of her story, and of course the sigil of House Mormont being a bear as well. So, I don't know. It might have some significance. It might not. And we get mention of where Dany lived when she was little. That was when they lived in Braavos, in the big house with the red door. Dany had her own room there, with a lemon tree outside her window. But of course, they don't stay in Braavos. Once Sir Willem dies, all of their possessions are stolen, and they're put out of the house, and Viserys keeps them moving through all of these different cities because he insists that Robert's hired knives are after them and trying to assassinate them. But Dany notes that she has never seen one of these hired knives. And that's a really interesting line because it makes you wonder, okay, was Dany just too young to notice that they needed to change locations because maybe somebody was following them or stalking them or whatever? Or what I think is more likely, and, you know, Dany being the perceptive one here, I think it's showing Viserys' paranoia and, you know, those little inklings of him being like King Aerys, because that's how it started with his father, you know, he had this paranoia, and then fucking Varys, master of whispers, whispering into his ear and like feeding into that paranoia, and it only grew and grew and grew. So, you know, I think this is definitely one of those hints that had Viserys not died the way that he had died, had he like gone on to continue his campaign to try to take back the throne, he probably would have met the same end as his father anyway, because he would have been vulnerable to that same kind of influence as his father was. We get further contrast between her and Viserys, their ideas of home, the jewels and the silks, Dragonstone and King's Landing, the Iron Throne and the Seven Kingdoms, all they have taken from us, we will have it back. Viserys lived for that day. All that Daenerys wanted back was the big house with the red door, the lemon tree outside her window, the childhood she had never known. Dany just wants to be a kid. She just wants to be a kid. She just wants to not have the weight of the world on her shoulders, and yet she does. All of these people talking about Jon Snow being the reluctant hero, Dany is too. Their hero reluctancy, or whatever you want to call it, it's different, but at the same time, you know, Dany doesn't want to seek power because she wants to be powerful. She wants it in order to help other people. As she goes throughout her journey, she's seeing all of these injustices throughout the world, and nobody's fucking doing anything about it. So she's like, fine, who else? No one else is doing anything. I guess I have to be the one, because no one else will. So fuck everybody who says that Dany is just power hungry, because no, you see right here exactly who she is and exactly what her motivations are. You know, all that Dany wants, if she had it her way, she would just have her house and like a husband and kids and a family and a simple life. But she knows that she can't seek this because there are other people in the world who don't have the luxury of choice. And she wants to help people and make sure that they have that choice. I know this is really salty, but I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry about it. Either enjoy the salt or leave. And even in this first chapter, right after Dany thinks that all she wants back is the house with the red door, we get this idea of slavery introduced into her story. You know, a lot of people like to talk about how Dany doesn't give a shit about slaves and slavery up until book 3 when she meets the Unsullied and she needs an army. But that isn't true, because very early on we get these seeds planted into her story, and you get the sense that this was a theme that was always supposed to be a part of her story. There was no slavery in the free city of Pentos. Nonetheless, there were slaves. Dany picking up on, that little loophole of Illyrio's, like, there is no slavery in Pentos, but he can be given slaves by his Dothraki friends, that she picks up on that, and is noting that there's technically not supposed to be slavery in this city, and yet Illyrio's got slaves anyway. A character like Viserys wouldn't note something like this, wouldn't note the fact that, Pentos is a free city and there's not supposed to be slavery in Pentos, and yet Illyrio has slaves. No one else would notice something like that, but Dany does. And even as the women are bathing her, you get the younger woman saying, Drogo is so rich that even his slaves wear golden collars. 100,000 men ride in his Khalasar, and his palace in Vaes Dothrak has 200 rooms and doors of solid silver. She's trying to present it as Drogo is like this great rich man, he's got silver doors, like, fuck the red door, the house the red door, he's got silver doors. But of course, none of that shit impresses Dany, and later on as they're dressing her, they put a gold collar around her neck. So how else is she supposed to read this situation? The girl had told her Drogo's slaves wear golden collars, they put a gold collar around her. What else is she to Drogo? So, that's the moment when Dany realizes she's a slave, and she's not wrong. So she's being bathed and dressed, she's thinking about, the possibility of being married to Drogo, and how she had always assumed growing up that she would marry Viserys. And she thinks this line that gets super fucking misinterpreted by a portion of the fandom we shall not speak of. But anyway, just want to clarify what this line means and why Dany thinks it. She had always assumed that she would wed Viserys when she came of age. For centuries, the Targaryens had married brother to sister, since Aegon the Conqueror had taken his sisters to bride. The line must be kept pure, Viserys had told her 1,000 times. Theirs was the king's blood, the golden blood of old Valyria, the blood of the dragons. Dragons did not mate with the beasts of the field, and Targaryens did not mingle their blood with that of lesser men. So, lots of people like to take that line and twist it and make it seem like Dany is the one who's thinking all of these things, like she's the one who believes that Targaryens shouldn't mix their blood with that of lesser men, blah blah blah, she is Nazi, she's racist, da da da. But that's not true. It clearly says Viserys had told her 1,000 times. These are Viserys' thoughts. This is what he thinks. These are not Dany's beliefs. How that could go over people's heads, I have no fucking idea. So Daenerys comes downstairs and she's all dressed and ready and done up for her big meeting with Khal Drogo, and Illyrio starts to praise her. May the Lord of Light shower you with blessings on this most fortunate day, Princess Daenerys, the Magister said as he took her hand. He bowed his head, showing a thin glimpse of crooked yellow teeth through the gold of his beard. She is a vision, Your Grace, a vision, he told her brother. Drogo will be enraptured. She's too skinny, Viserys said. So, Viserys can't even fucking take Dany being given a compliment by another person. That is how fucking big his ego is. Like, Illyrio starts to praise Dany, and he immediately tears her down. She's too skinny. Like, he then asks Illyrio, are you sure Khal Drogo likes his women this young? Like, he's anxious that, it's not gonna go through. But at the same time, like, Illyrio's the smart one who set all of this up. Of course, he's going to ensure that it goes well, otherwise it would reflect badly on his business. But it's so obvious that Viserys is just saying this because he can't stand that Dany is going to be in the spotlight. And, he goes on to, say, oh, well, I guess these Dothraki savages have queer tastes. As if anybody who could be attracted to Dany would have to have odd and abnormal tastes in women or whatever. So it just further shows how insecure his character is and how, he's jealous of Dany. So they're on their way to Drogo's manse, and Viserys is strategizing. He could take the entirety of the Seven Kingdoms with only 10,000 Dothraki screamers. And he's talking about all of this stuff. The realm will rise for its rightful king. Tyrell, Redwyne, Derry, Greyjoy, they have no more love for the usurper than I do. The Dornishmen burn to avenge Elia and her children, and the small folk will be with us. They cry out for their king. He looked at Illyrio anxiously. They do, don't they? Here, again, we see Viserys' insecurities popping up. He wants to be loved. He wants to be the center of attention. He wants to be the king that the small folk cry out for. It's basically the story that he's told himself, that the people really hate Robert and they're crying out for the true king. And, of course, Illyrio is more than willing to back up this story with, his agents from across the Narrow Sea. But Dany's listening to all of their bullshit, and she's just not buying it. And that's one of the reasons why I love her character, because she just, she's hearing all this and she's like, no, that's not, pretty sure that's not how it's gonna go. Dany had no agents, no way of knowing what anyone was doing or thinking across the Narrow Sea, but she mistrusted Illyrio's sweet words as she mistrusted everything about Illyrio. Her brother was nodding eagerly, however. So Viserys is just like, yeah, you're right. They're crying out for the true king. They love me. They're sewing dragon banners and all this bullshit. And Dany is just like, no. I mean, it's not like she can say any of this. This is why, it's all in her head. And I think that's one of the reasons why, probably with the show, when you don't have incredibly skilled writers, it can be difficult to translate her character, because a lot of this is in her head and it's not anything that she's spoken, and there's no character for Dany to confide in and play off of. So all of these thoughts just stay in her head. And Illyrio is so full of shit, but George makes it clear to the audience that Illyrio is full of shit, but Viserys is just entirely clueless. So Viserys says, I shall kill the usurper myself, he promised, who had never killed anyone, as he killed my brother Rhaegar, and Lannister too, the Kingslayer, for what he did to my father. That would be most fitting, Magister Illyrio said. Dany saw the smallest hint of a smile playing around his full lips, but her brother did not notice. Illyrio's just like, yeah, sure, you're gonna kill all of these people and you've never killed anyone. And Dany sees that Illyrio is basically laughing at her brother. Ned should have listened to Catelyn, Viserys should listen to Dany, and he probably wouldn't have died. They're both dumb men who should listen to the women in their lives. So they get to Drogo's manse, and this is when we're introduced to the character of Ser Jorah Mormont. And I think the way that we are introduced to his character is really fucking interesting. The man with the green beard is brother to the Acheron of Tyrosh, and the man behind him is Ser Jorah Mormont. The last name caught Daenerys. A knight? No less, Illyrio smiled through his beard. Anointed with the 7 oils by the High Septon himself. What is he doing here? She blurted. The usurper wanted his head, Illyrio told them. Some trifling affront. He sold some poachers to a Tyroshi slaver instead of giving them to the Night's Watch. Absurd law. A man should be able to do what he likes with his own chattel. So we're introduced to Jorah, and we're told his backstory right from the start. And again, we're getting these hints of slavery being a theme in Dany's story. Jorah could have broken any law in Westeros that would have caused him to go into exile. But the fact that George chose him to be in exile because he was selling to slavers, I think has to have some importance here, because, throughout this whole chapter, we've been presented with this idea of people, skirting around these laws and taking advantage of other people. Illyrio, of course he doesn't fucking care that Jorah was selling to slavers, because he lives in a city that's supposed to be slavery free, and yet he gets his slaves from his Dothraki friends. And Dany is noticing all of this. She's recalling what Illyrio's slave girl had told her about Drogo's slaves wearing gold collars. She makes note of the Unsullied Guard's collar when they came in. And of course, she's a slave herself, or she's going to be. She is kind of right now, but it's gonna be without question as soon as she marries Drogo. So Illyrio goes to grab Drogo so that he can introduce them, and as he walks away, Viserys points Drogo out to Dany. Dany looked at Khal Drogo. His face was hard and cruel, his eyes as cold and dark as onyx. Her brother hurt her sometimes when she woke the dragon, but he did not frighten her the way this man frightened her. I know that George romanticizes the shit out of Dany and Drogo's wedding night and how, you know, it becomes Dany's choice and they start their marriage off on a good foot, blah, blah, blah. If George wanted people to buy into Dany and Drogo having a good relationship and it not being, you know, like completely Stockholm Syndrome and all of that shit, one, he should have made Dany a whole lot older, and two, like, he shouldn't have included fucking descriptions like this. Like, her brother did not frighten her the way this man frightened her. Like, she's terrified of Drogo, and she's terrified about the prospect of marrying him. He frightens her so much that she has some of her only dialogue in the entire chapter telling Viserys, please, I want to go home, I don't want to be his queen. And we're just supposed to forget that. So when Dany tells him that, Viserys obviously gets even more horrible toward her. I'd let his whole Khalasar fuck you if need be, sweet sister. All 40,000 men and their horses too, if that is what it took to get my army. So, like, Dany is already frightened of this dude that she doesn't know, this, you know, like, he's the tallest guy in the room, he doesn't even speak her language, he's somebody she doesn't know. She's supposed to be married off to him. He's this, like, crazy warlord. And, you know, she's terrified. And Viserys does nothing to comfort her. You know what? If he wants to let his whole Khalasar fuck you just so I can have my army, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Like, Viserys is so vile. He treats Dany just like a piece of trash. The only value she has to him is monetary. She's not... like, he doesn't even think of her as family. She's just a bargaining chip. I need my army, I want my throne, I want to take it back, I want all the jewels and all the silks and everything, and fuck everybody who gets in my way, including Dany. Like, I don't care about you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to him. And the way that this chapter ends is just such a fucking gut punch, because it doesn't even include Dany meeting Drogo. It just is all of the tension leading up to that, and, you know, Dany having to put on this, you know, facade so that she doesn't anger her brother, so that he doesn't abuse her when they leave. Smile, Viserys whispered nervously, his hand falling to the hilt of his sword, and stand up straight. Let him see that you have breasts. Gods know you have little enough as it is. Dany smiled and stood up straight. That is the final line of this chapter. Just really fucking drives home the position that Dany is in and how little power she has no power. She is powerless in the situation. Viserys and Illyrio are controlling everything, and all she can do is try to minimize her suffering. You know, like, she's still gonna have to marry Drogo. She really can't change that, but she can at least appease Viserys so that he doesn't beat her up later. That is her life, and it fucking sucks. And that's the end of the chapter. Like, that's what we're left with. Dany is such a great character, and there's so many things within this chapter that I think just really hammer home who Dany is as a person. This first chapter of Dany's really sets it up perfectly for her to go on to be that great ruler, or for Dany to set up someone else for success to be a great ruler, and then she can just, you know, she can just retire and fuck off and have her house with the red door and her simple life, because, you know, he really hammers it home here. That's all Dany wants. She just wants her simple life and her house with the red door. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Daenerys I of a Game of Thrones. If you guys agree or disagree, let me know in the comments what were your thoughts when you were reading this, and I will see you guys in the next video.